Can everyone see that okay?
That's great, thanks, Andrew.
Just see if I can go up and down, which I can, perfect. Okay, thank you, Liz, for the opportunity to speak today. I have 30 minutes, is that right?
That's right, but you know, give or take, so don't worry too much.
Yeah, it's probably the longest anyone's allowed me to speak before, so I'm not used to speaking that long. So it's, but yeah, I don't think I'll be as long as that. But yeah, thank you, Liz, for the opportunity to speak, and congratulations to Liz on taking over as convener for the RIG after Ron. And hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I see lots of familiar faces and names. It's great to see you all. I hope everyone's well and everyone's managed to be happy and productive during these trying times. When I was asked by this to talk today, I wasn't too sure about what to talk about. Considering the audience, I thought I would avoid certain abstract topics, but I thought I'll go for it anyway and see how we get on. So I hope you indulge me for a bit today while I talk about governance in more sort of theoretical and analytical terms than I usually do, I suppose. The impetus for this talk actually has come from a few different projects, all projects, things I'm writing, several interrelated things I'm writing about. One is on risk and market discipline within decentralized education systems. There's another one on publics and the role of governance in summoning and compelling different kinds of publics, and ideas around risk regulation and public trust. So in all of that, it just got me thinking about what is governance. And over the last 3 months, actually, I've examined about 3 PhDs, one in Australia, South Africa, and England. And in all of them, one of the things I always picked up on was I had to keep asking, what do you mean by governance? And I felt that it's become, at least in some circles, I imagine in some of the BELMAS related journals, it's probably been developed in a much more sophisticated way. But in general, when my role, I'm on the Journal of Education Policy as an editorial role for Europe. And typically this comes up a lot. Whenever I see governance, it's kind of thrown in there like this catch-all term to describe so many different things. And it's quite disappointing when you consider how it's been developed in the kind of policy sciences and political sciences and social sciences, mainly from where it emanated. So I thought I'd use this opportunity to talk a bit about how governance can be differently conceptualized, and moving forward, how we can move away from more indiscriminate use and insufficient critique that I often see in education research in different fields and subfields. So I'm not going to talk about governance from a strategic operational capacity. I'm not going to talk about operational allocative efficiency or school effectiveness and improvement. That's something that we could talk specifically, if you like. Maybe some of the ideas that come up may relate to that. I hope they do. But again, I hope you just indulge me while I take a step back and just think about the application of using different theoretical approaches to frame meanings and practices of governance. So I'll just give an overview. So what I'd like to discuss is the role of governance as, well, these are the different separate things I want to talk about. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with at least governance in general, and not specifically school governance, but education governance, which has become its own subfield within education, really. I suppose this paper is more about looking at the position of governance within education broadly. So that covers and spans lots of different subfields. So I'm very interested in how education has become this kind of meta-narrative and master signifier now. In some ways, it's been used in the same way that neoliberalism has for a very long time. In lots of cases, replacing it, often used interchangeably. So there's lots of indiscriminate use, and it reduces lots of complex social, political, cultural changes. And I don't think it should be there to do that. So again, this is just an opportunity for me just to think more about how it can be used more strategically and precisely. So what I want to do is talk a bit about meta-narratives and the role of governance as a meta-narrative, and then describe a quick historical context for the emergence of the concept of governance, mainly its relation to globalization, and then use some applied theory and show the utility of theory for how governance can be differently conceptualized from the position of different theoretical orientations. And I've listed a few of them here. And then I'll just conclude by outlining some of the aims and benefits of deconstructing governance from the perspective of these different theoretical positions. So, and again, I apologize in advance if some of this, the way I'm talking may seem slightly abstract. I try to avoid as much as I can, but in order to have this discussion I want to, I'm going to have to talk about certain concepts, but I will do the best I can to offer us, as much clarifying language as I can along the way. I'm not going to use theory for theory's sake. I want to demonstrate its utility and application. So for those of you familiar with sort of postmodern turn, again, what I'm trying to do is show the position of education governance within education research broadly and where I see it at the moment. And I think perhaps going into the future where it needs to be. So a defining feature of the postmodern term was this sort of rejection of modernist narratives. This attempt to explain everything according to certain metaphysical ideations. We have European and Enlightenment narratives. They all presupposed a rational subject, a universal subject, and it often conflated scientific progress with this kind of rationalization of society. And against these narratives, we have what we call meta-narratives. These were the big meta-narratives of modernism. We had these postmodern approaches. And they postulated that truth was an outcome of historically contingent struggles and conflicts. So there are no origins or essences to truth. Truth is serendipity. However, what I've noticed a lot in working with researchers, emerging researchers, established researchers in the education field is, there are some postmodern, post-structuralist researchers that typically occupy this, what we call a hybrid position. So they have these commitments to nominalism. That's a commitment to the denial of universal or eternal truths. And then they have this element of soft determinism. So soft determinism occurs when researchers reduce complex phenomena to the influence of overarching structures and relations, hegemonic projects, governmental rationalities, and this is fairly typical across all disciplines, especially education. And education researchers are no different, despite their claims to being postmodernist or post-structuralist. So they denounce these essentialist claims of universal truths, while at the same time they integrate these meta-narratives into their analyses, often to comfortably navigate and explain what are messy social realities. These meta-narratives provide education researchers with meaning-making tools for narrating these realities, indeed coping with them, coping with the complexity of these realities. So the appeal of these meta-narratives is they're consoling. And I'm sure you have lots in mind that you could think of. They give coherence to our grievances and our discontents. They help to provide this kind of constitutive outside against which we can position and elevate ourselves morally and politically. And neoliberalism has become one of those. Everything's neoliberal, all this is neoliberal. And in turn, what it does is allow those people to, as I said, kind of position, elevate themselves politically, morally. But we know neoliberalism has a very complicated intellectual history and relationship to different political and economic projects, authoritarianism, neoconservatism, third-way social democracy. Yet despite all those instabilities, neoliberalism is used by researchers to support structuralist narratives and claims which reduce complex phenomena to expressions and functions of, say, market determinism. People look at higher education, look at schools and say, yeah, that's an expression of market determinism, that's an expression of financialization. So in a way, education becomes constituted by neoliberal forces, becomes a default position for lots of researchers. So hence the structuralist orientation of some so-called postmodern research. These meta-narratives produce kind of deterministic accounts of social change. And often the danger here, and it happens a lot, is that agency and will or social change, it becomes reduced to this kind of residual effect of structural power, marketization or financialization, whatever it wants to be. And another much cited term, what's in education research, has become governance now. Governance seems to be replacing neoliberalism in lots of words. It's a kind of default expression for things that we know about or things that we might be against. And it's often used very loosely to describe the formal and informal means of securing power and authority over something or someone, usually for the purpose of improving efficiency, affecting behavior change, or enhancing accountability and transparency. And these similar meanings can be traced through the language of international organizations and some national governments, where governance is articulated in a strictly normative sense to describe strategies for achieving specific goals and outcomes. And this leads to indiscriminate use, and like neoliberalism, governance risks becoming just another empty signifier for articulating and condensing a wide variety of complex social, political, and economic changes. So now I want to turn your attention to the historical emergence of governance, its relationship to globalization. I think this is useful for understanding the genealogy of the concepts, both from a conceptual and normative standpoint. So again, if you indulge me for a bit, I think it's important to trace this lineage and where we are with it now. So during the 90s and 80s, social political scientists, they began documenting the technological and economic and social cultural effects of globalization. The focus of these investigations ranged from the local to the transnational, from micro qualitative studies looking at the mediation of human relations through new communications technologies, to macro quantitative studies looking at transformation of national economies through trade liberalization and capital mobility. Yet despite the promise of new modes of transnational capital accumulation, technologically driven social connectivity, globalization created new kinds of economic risks and insecurities. So we saw during the late 70s, 80s, 90s, the subordination of national economies to new global patterns of competition and flexible, deregulated labor. This undermined local labor markets, labor movements in many developing and developed countries. The rapid acceleration of interconnections and flows between diverse localities across the globe also worked to challenge national imaginaries, including the idea of the nation state as a bounded ethno-cultural and political entity. So increased migration, tourism, hyper-connectivity opened up all kinds of possibilities for transnational movements, new ethnic identities, and multicultural spaces. So national governments, in effect, were forced to rethink economic and cultural processes as multi-causal, and multidimensional. And the key thing here, to develop strategies for coping with the diversity and complexity that flow from these processes. And this is where governance comes in. So in response to these new spatial and ontological arrangements, the term governance gained popularity as a concept for understanding changes in the development of political and economic systems. But more specifically, researchers became interested in the role of the nation state in the global political economy, and therefore turned their attention to the impact of international organizations and relations on the state practices and citizenship. So the rise of global corporations, international organizations, political and economic unions, OECD, European Union. This meant that politics and authority could no longer be studied from the single vantage point or isolated entity of like the nation state or government. Globalization introduced a new network logic of flows characterized by spontaneous self-organization, sometimes called heterarchy, which is the opposite of hierarchy. So here we see how governance is used to describe the movement away from hierarchy and top-down government, and its substitution by these new flexible modes of governing defined by plural and dispersed forms of power. And it's probably a big part of the rhetoric around our academization, a kind of self-referential, plural, spontaneous interaction that comes from decentralized education systems and school autonomy. But at the same time, governance is used in a normative sense to capture the changing nature of state practices under globalization and their strategies and rationalities for governing complex societies. And we saw this a lot during the 1970s, where many countries experienced severe economic stagnation, and high inflation owing to globalisation. So in response, different nation states supported a new vision of government where economic and social policy was disciplined by fiscal responsibility and intense marketisation and privatisation. And we saw this with different right-wing governments and military dictatorships, Pinochet in Chile, Reagan in the US, Thatcher in England, and the NRP, or the National Reorganization Process in Argentina. So a key strategy to these reforms was to sell off publicly owned assets to private companies and to expand the role of non-state actors and organizations in the management and delivery of welfare services. So when we think about governance, it's important to note that these reforms were not about national governments conceding power so much as conceding ownership and management in most cases. So all governments have a political strategic interest in maintaining some control of the constituent parts of its system, which they do through designing rules and regulations that help them realize different policy goals and outcomes. So we see this in education and public services, where governments, they concede responsibility to run services, but while at the same time they shape the possibilities for self-governance through changes in legislation, law, and usually funding agreements. And these are indirect methods of governing, and they can include performance monitoring, quality assessment, even good governance guidelines, professional standards of conduct, all there to incentivize and punish different behaviors. So, governance therefore describes both the absence of direct government, but also the continued work of government in compelling different behaviors and orientations, albeit they don't always succeed, so it's often done imperfectly and indirectly. So now I just want to talk about applied theory to show how, governance can be conceptualized from the position of different theoretical orientations. And there are lots of overlaps in the development of these approaches, given that they are broadly what you can call post-positivist or post-structuralist. That is to say, unlike positivism, they are not concerned with fixing and enforcing meanings about the nature of social reality. They are not normative prescriptions for governance. And they're not there to say what governance is for. Instead, what they have in common is they view claims to knowledge and knowledge production to be intimately historical and cultural. And therefore, they deviate from now prevalent popular functionalist understandings of governance, namely that governance is a space for, the rationalist planning aimed at calculation and management of choices and costs in a way that can predict and optimize efficiency and effectiveness. And this is how governance is typically understood. But nonetheless, despite their rejection of functionalist accounts of governance, they are distinctive through making possible different kinds of analytical and political work, which I intend to show today. So therefore, each position I'll discuss separately in order to make explicit their epistemological and their normative commitments. So a popular view of governance among some academics and many policymakers. Liz, how much time do I have left? Do I have 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
You have around 10 minutes, so that's fine.
10 minutes. That's more than enough time. Thank you, Liz. So a popular view of governance among some academics and policymakers is that decentralized welfare planning through public-private partnerships and innovative and democratic. They undermine vertical relations of power, and they enable the conditions for genuine trust building and cooperation between different stakeholders. This is very much a visionary, even utopian view of governance that is shared by governments, international organizations, and lots of people. However, it's not shared by everyone. Against this somewhat, you can call this as sort of the postmodern reading of governance, if you like. Governance is self-referential, it's reflexive, it's plural, it's self-defining. We have Davies here, and he adopts a Gramscian approach to show how governance develops through the persistence rather than the erasure of vertical relations of power. So for Davies, governance is integral to neoliberal hegemonic ideology and strategy, since it derives its legitimacy from upholding the dominance of specific kinds of exclusionary and inclusionary practices that help to maintain and regulate who gets to inhabit and perform governance. I just want to say actually that I'm not here to endorse or approve or say that I agree with all these positions. I'm just here to present these positions and what they tell us about governance. Moreover, Davies views government as indispensable to governance, since it creates forms of what he calls meta-governance or meta-policy. And this conditions the possibility for its development and non-development. So for Davies, he disputes this government governance dualism in favor of this Gramscian approach that views strategies of governing through networks and public-private partnerships as what he would probably see. I mean, if I had to guess, and I don't want to say this is what he thinks, but as a kind of restorative project, it's designed to reproduce specific forms of capital accumulation and class power that maintain the kind of regulative ideal of late capitalism. And then we can move on to Pierre and Guy Peters. And similarly, they challenge this now popular concept of governing without government. This is often a kind of, again, kind of rhetoric we often hear from successive governments over 20 years when it comes to decentralized reforms within our own system, that we're done with hierarchy and top-down government. In fact, what we have is heterarchy and governance or governing. But they challenge this concept for their adoption of what their state-centric approach to governance. So for Pierre and Guy Peters, governance is a reconfiguration of state power rather than an expression of its retreat or subordination. So Pierre and Guy Peters, they acknowledge the degree to which the state under globalization disperses all this power outwards and downwards. However, like Davies, they highlight the continuing importance of the state to governance between modern societies, namely the extent to which the state functions to regulate interactions between systems and institutions. And also like Davies, they challenge the idea that networks, and this is key, that networks and partnerships function effortlessly as sites for enabling bargaining, interaction and trust building between stakeholders. This is because such a view overestimates the rational capacity of those networks or partnerships to govern effectively or indeed fairly in the interests and norms of others. So against this utopian view of governance, what Pierre, Guy Peters and Davies have in common is the argument that the political and bureaucratic mechanisms that are essential to a sustainable democratic state, given the inabilities of these loose networks and partnerships to effectively coordinate conflict resolution and coherence within our own complex societies. And then moving on, in contrast to Pierre and Guy Peters, who question the capacity of networks to operate effectively as mediating spaces for conflict resolution or trust building, Cumin employs a deliberative organizing approach, and this stresses the spontaneous self-organizing capacity of networks or partnerships. Sorry, I was slightly distracted by the beeping there. So which he sees governance as he sees it as a mutual interactive learning environment. So for Cumin, governance develops through the intersubjective production of truths. It's made possible by different actors engaging in strategic rational bargaining. So from this perspective, Cumin moves beyond an exclusive focus of the state to demonstrate the constitutive and enabling effects of communicative reasoning. This is a Habermasian term. If any of you have heard of Jürgen Habermas, he believed in that actors have communicative reasoning capacity to resolve the differences between themselves. So he's very much in support of that as a normative basis for human interactions and governance. So I'm speeding through this, realizing I probably have only about 7 minutes left. And then for Bevere and Rhodes, governance is a product of the interplay. It says here, the interplay and contest of beliefs or meanings embedded in human activity. So governance in this respect, it can't be understood exclusively from a systems theory or institutionalist perspective, like Davies or Jean-Pierre might tell us, because institutional relations and logics, they only ever function as proxies, or aggregate concepts for the interplay and contest of meaning that are going on and changing all the time and every day. So in this sense, Bevere and Rhodes, their adoption is more closely resembles Cumin's deliberative interactive approach, with their shared emphasis on the relational constitution of governance through social interaction. However, the difference is here, Bevere and Rhodes refute the idea that governance can be reduced to a communicated model of action, something that presumes that all actors work or must be trained to work from a standard rationality or some ideal of perfect knowledge. So Cumin, for example, often appears to overestimate the capacity of social actors to translate their interests into pragmatic forms of social action that are agreeable or acceptable to everyone. And finally, this is the last one I'm going to mention. Sorry, my mouth's very dry. That's what I get for talking really quickly. Miller and Rose, they adopt a governmentality approach to governance. And this helps us to think about governance as rationalities and strategies, primarily designed to produce particular kinds of subjects and forms of interaction among subjects. So similar to the Gramscian framework, a governmentality approach, it views governance as modes of power for administering, managing, and intervening upon the behavior of people, of others, albeit it lacks any strict focus on these modes of power as, class-based projects as Davies might. But it's also similar to a state-centric analytic model in that it emphasizes the fundamental importance of power and politics to governance, especially the role of political rationalities and bureaucracies to the formalization of experts and of expert knowledge and the specification of problems and their solutions. So to conclude, what I've tried to do is deconstruct governance from the viewpoint of these different theoretical positions in order to make explicit its polyvalence, something which is not done enough, I think, within the broader education research and many of its subdisciplines. So to highlight its polyvalence as a contested subject, but also as an emergent and situated practice. So in doing so, I've tried to present a kind of multi-dimensional perspective that I hope challenges the prevalence of what are functionalist accounts of governance. So we often know from a functionalist perspective, as I've mentioned, that sometimes governance is reduced to a form of kind of rationalist planning to predict and optimize efficiency and effectiveness. So this can include the application of universal or standards rationality against which governance failure can be measured, evaluated, and improved to meet agreed policy solutions and public interests or strategic priorities. And again, these functionalist accounts are prevalent in lots of research and policy documents produced by international organizations, the World Bank, the OECD, among others. So here, governance is used to mean improvements to the quality of regulation, namely the development of specific forms of regulation, compliance checks, high-stake testing or performance benchmarking and appraisal, all of which help to enhance the steering capacity of funding and regulatory authorities to hold organizations to account. And the OECD and World Bank are very explicit on this. Their approach to governance, this is what's to be used for. But as I've tried to show, governance is far more slippery than this definition allows for. So through deconstructing it through the vantage point of all these different positions, I've tried to denaturalize governance and challenge the dominance of functionalism as this kind of default expression for governance. So this includes using theory to highlight possibilities for engaging in different kinds of analytical and political work, including the study of the governance-politics relationship, which is probably not discussed enough, to be honest. The role of governance in the cultivation of particular forms of self-governing among citizens and the creation of different publics, consumer publics, democratic publics. This also means moving beyond, perhaps, an evaluative or functionalist concern with producing strategic knowledge in the service of governance, and instead asking critical questions about the role of power and knowledge to governance, namely the ways in which power and claims to knowledge are inscribed in models of good governance and effective governance. And I'll leave it there, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really thought-provoking and insightful. And I am going to stop the recording there.